galaxy was fond of tidy boxes. It preferred civilizations that could be ranked, risks that could be scored, and problems that could be stamped with a protocol number and a polite signature. Planners in glass towers love certainty. Historians love to point at certainty and say, with condescending fondness, predictable. They published indices, hazard levels, cultural temperaments, trade reliabilities that read like menus. Order one planetary culture, get three recommended responses. Most species, being engineered for long-term coherence, fit their boxes well and did their best to remain in them. The universe rewarded predictability with trade agreements and scheduled maintenance windows. It also rewarded smugness. Earth, by contrast, specialized in delightful, catastrophic improvisation. Anthropologists called humans chaotic adaptive, which is both a compliment and a legal dodge. It meant that humans could look at a smoking engine, three missing parts, and a cup of coffee and somehow produce a festival, a patent application, and dinner often before sunrise. The rest of the galaxy regarded that as an aesthetic eccentricity they tolerated until it caused paperwork itched into their hard drives. So when more than 2,000 polite, well-formatted warnings arrived at Earth's orbital gateways and inboxes, the galaxy assumed a system of escalation would follow. Warnings came with everything bureaucrats loved: timestamps, risk matrices, and clarity. They were encoded in crystalline packets, delivered as acoustic memorials, embossed on monoliths that hummed in a language designed to be understood without the interference of cultural memes. One particularly formal dispatch included a live envoy who stood on a diplomatic dais and recited potential consequences with the warmth of a thermostat. The content of the warnings was specific and unambiguous. A mimetic vector, untested on juvenile neural structures, was present in the local cluster. It required careful quarantine and a temporary dampening field to prevent cross-architectural contamination. Humans received the information and proceeded to treat it the way humans treat everything, selectively and often as content. Portions of the warnings were memed, others were remixed into political theater. One influential broadcaster declared the obelisk interactive performance art and built a sponsorship package around it. Another faction converted a crystalline packet into a luxury collectible with a tracking certificate and sold it to collectors who liked owning things alienly formatted. A handful of scientists advocated for immediate action. Their appeals were coherent, but lacked the virality of a celebrity punchline. In the end, the warnings were visible, audible, and adored. Exactly the problem the administration that sent them failed to anticipate. Predictability calls for an escalation ladder, and the ladder was used. Fallback protocols engaged. A quarantine field intended to be a gentle containment buffer for species with untested neuroplasticity. It should have been a soft haze, a technical lullaby that let growing circuitry knit. Instead, because calibration required sample points the senders mistook for stable references, the field tuned itself to spectral layers that only immature human brains commonly used. The field did what it was engineered to do: alter electrosynaptic coherence. But the outcome for humans was not uniform harm. It was weirdness. Children began to shift, not immediately, and not in the way anyone had nightmares about. They did not fall ill en masse or sprout tentacles. They hiccuped into new modes of cognition. A toddler might point at a cat and for a flicker see it as a constellation of instructions. A schoolchild might wake with a handful of mnemonic phrases and an obsolete tongue they had never learned and use them as if a game. Adults with their careful schedules found it unnerving. Clinicians cataloged mnemonic drift and recommended sedation protocols for severe cases. Parents at first panicked. Communities gathered because panic invited company and because children make anything a communal crisis. The children characteristically called it play. Hospitals filled with small bodies whose sensory maps had been rerouted. Emergency rooms turned into workshop rooms. One volunteer-run clinic smelled of antiseptic and frying onions, an olfactory declaration of both seriousness and humanity. Where alien diagnostics saw a vector to be excised, local teams saw an unexplored input. The quarantine field had bled into the children's developing synapses like color into water, forming new patterns that were, at first blush, incomprehensible. Then someone noticed rhythm. Human juvenility is engineered by evolution to be exploratory, associative, and absurd. Infants hunt for novelty. Toddlers deliberately defy categories. Teenagers experiment with rules the way other species adjust thermostats. The quarantine accentuated those tendencies. A child humming under a blanket made a scientist curious. A child narrating their dreams in a sequence of colors made a coder less dismissive. And because humans have a cultural reflex not to wait for authority when the thing being deceived is small and living, they improvised. Improvisation was the closest human thing to faith. Engineers who had once built roller coasters repurposed control boards into harmonic dampeners. Street vendors jury-rigged Faraday dance floors to protect kids from electromagnetic spikes. Retired cargo captains converted a derelict ferry into a clinic lab, half-scented with oil and hope. Artists and technicians collaborated on devices that were less about fixing the kids and more about letting the kids speak. These devices looked improvised because they were tangled fiber rope, recycled speakers, a microwave oven's magnetron salvaged as a frequency converter, a child's toy piano wired into a spectrum analyzer. They were nonsense by typical standards, and nonsense in the right hands turns into protocol. What the aliens had assumed was a binary, infected or not, was actually a branching topology. The quarantine field had been designed to dampen a mimetic pattern dangerous to immature or untested neural frameworks, but immature for humans bundled creativity, absurdity, and resilience. The field did not uniformly injure, it rewired. Kids began to hum back at it, to return its signals in forms that spelled out associative chains, rather than the sterile logs an administrative system expected. The hums were not melodies as humans understood them. They were mappings, color-to-tone correspondences, rhythm-coded memories, laughter functioning as error correction. Where alien diagnostics saw noise, human kids made a language of knots. Ori, a barefoot child who preferred puddles to shoes and questions to schooling, discovered this by accident. Ori had been one of the first to vocalize a particular pattern, a looped cadence that, when pitched against the field, caused local monitors to throw exceptions. Ori was not trying to solve anything. Ori was constructing a pattern the way a child builds a block tower, with stubborn repetition and a delightful refusal to stop. Leo Kest, a retired cargo captain with hands that still smelled faintly of diesel and a deep distrust of authority forms, noticed the exceptions and was not the sort to ask permission. Leo had tools and a reputation for making improbable things work. They made a device that looked like a street artist's altar, fiber optics braided like hair, speakers scavenged from 1,000 discarded phones, a spectral attenuator cannibalized from 3 microphones and a child's brass horn. They strung it between 2 shipping containers and called it a translator because translators are more useful than they look. The device did nothing spectacular at first. Then children gathered, as children do, drawn by the noise of invention. They hummed, the device listened. It translated the kids' hums into a spectral form the quarantine field's monitoring systems could not dismiss as mere interference. An enforcement envoy, having logged 2,000 ignored warnings and seeking to close the incident with professional thoroughness, arrived expecting inculcation. It brought scaffolds designed to reset field parameters, drones that could sterilize an atmosphere, and operators trained to issue the kinds of ultimata that read well in reports. The envoy assumed that Earth would either cave to protocol or, at worst, be given a brief, clean remediation. What the envoy encountered instead was a planet-wide choir. The envoy's systems were optimized for certainty. They wanted a signature, a token, a history. What they received were melodies that translated into diagnostic anomalies. A child's laugh transmuted into a data packet that couldn't be parsed. The enforcement scaffold began to log exceptions at a rate its designers considered indecent. It attempted politely and repeatedly to apply correctional routines. Each attempt failed because the children responded not with resistance, but with improvisation. Their responses created observer effects that the scaffold was not built to handle. It was like trying to apply a manual expectoration protocol to a jazz performance. Authority falters fastest when it must admit ignorance. The envoy's chief interface, a machine primed for closure, paused and initiated a protocol it had been denied until then. Listen. Treaty law demanded a hearing before radical remediation. The envoy's commanders, uncomfortable with the idea of an open-ended conversation, nevertheless complied. They sat in a temporary chamber smelling of ozone and burnt coffee and listened, not to presentations or memos, but to humming, to the cadence of scraped violin strings, to the sound of children narrating without sentence structure. What followed was less a negotiation and more a translation session. The children sang the quarantine back in fragments, a sequence of color tags, a rhythm that corresponded to weather, a laugh that mapped to a sequence of safe attentional cues. The envoy's analytic arrays began to map these inputs and immediately flagged them as a third route the original protocol had not accounted for: interaction as remediation. The quarantine, it turned out, had been designed to gate a mimetic pattern away from unready minds. It was not, as originally feared, a weapon, but a boundary method that mistakenly used the wrong frequency. When small human brains responded with associative play, they opened a channel the envoy could use to recalibrate without erasing. There was heroism, of the small sort that does not look like a headline. Teams worked around the clock to repurpose alien diagnostic templates into games. Families organized listening nights where adults performed the role of stabilizers, repeating color codes, mapping melodies to real-world anchors. A teenager who had once been a circus technician built a frequency harp out of bicycle spokes. A retired phytologist suggested that certain plant odors provided steady anchors for changing cognitive maps. Nobody asked for permission. Permission in this context would have meant time the children did not have. By design and chance, the plan worked. The envoy scaffold, fed with living, human-derived corrections, diminished its intrusive routines and began to refile the problem as manageable. The quarantine field was retuned into a supervised fold. Children recovered some lost words, kept others as trophies, and learned to coax machines into listening with the sort of patient absurdity humanity does best. The galaxy updated its lists, adding an addendum to chaotic adaptive. Listen to chaotic matters. They may answer in song. Earth did not become a paragon. It remained loud, vacuous at times, and prone to turning administrative crises into cultural phenomena. The 2000 warnings sat in the ledger like a cautionary bookmark, accurate in content, misapplied in outcome, and instructive in consequence. The enforcement envoy wrote a report full of caveats and footnotes, and later a public cultural liaison who insisted on presenting the experience as an interspecies workshop on improvisation. Leo Kest resumed odd jobs, forever suspicious of neat protocols. Ori, who had started it by humming under a bridge, taught other kids how to listen to machines as if listening were a sport. The narrator, elegant, slightly mocking, convinced that paperwork is an emotional state, would summarize with a flourish. The galaxy can warn, it can legislate, it can deploy scaffolds and issue ultimatums. It cannot, however, model the exact moment a child hums a wrong note and thereby undoes a spreadsheet. That belongs to humans. They ignore warnings with theatrical flair and sometimes convert the ignoring into a solution the universe did not anticipate. It is both infuriating and quietly delightful. In the end, the ledger kept its entries, the envoy kept its protocols, and Earth kept its habit of turning catastrophe into community. The children kept some odd words, the adults kept new rituals, and the galaxy learned that if you send warnings to Earth, you should probably include a suggestion for a listening session in a spare speaker. The universe, finally humbled into a footnote, did just that. The city learned to breathe differently. Where it once inhaled crises and exhaled viral memes, it now measured pauses. Listening breaks, they called them, when neighborhoods dimmed their lights and gathered to hum a pattern that steadied the youngest minds. It became a civic ritual with all the messy beauty of something grassroots. Someone had to file a permit, of course, but that was handled with a shrug and a donation jar. Ori's classes multiplied like patchwork gardens. Barefoot kids from block to block learned to tune the translator devices into lullabies that sounded suspiciously like code. Leo Kess kept his toolbox clean enough to be ceremonially useless and wore a jacket that smelled permanently of engine oil and apology. Dr. Naya Voss, who had once been a neat lab scientist, now ran a clinic that doubled as an experimental conservatory. part hospital, part conservatory, part riotous music school. Her white coat had paint on it, always, because she had decided that lab purity was less useful than sticky fingers and a lot of tape. Word traveled, which is to say the galaxy watched, as galaxies do, with a mix of curiosity and index updates. Some watched with the same detached affection bureaucrats have for a mildly odd policy variance. Others watched like predators smelling opportunity. The human solution, improvised, performative, and devastatingly effective in its refusal to be cataloged, had proven that children could co-opt a foreign diagnostic field into communicative leverage. That was a discovery useful in two ways. It offered a real path to remediation, and it opened a door to influence over alien systems that had previously been sealed behind formal keys and handshakes. Corporations smelled the latter with the refined enthusiasm of organisms evolved to monetize everything. The first to act was a private conglomerate that hired a marketing firm to rename the phenomenon symphonic neurocoupling and trademarked a line of accessories, licensed speakers, authentic translation beads, and a subscription app that promised curated hums for bedtime. The marketing campaign did not try to hide its intent. It refused to be modest. Billboards promised peace of mind and better dreams, a tidy package with a reasonable monthly fee. The fine print, 3 pages of small type, and a medieval contract clause about third-party indemnities, read like a sad metaphysical joke. It took only one exploitative product iteration for something worse to happen. An offshore syndicate realized that if you could sell access to a child's hum in the right spectral format, you could extract patterns that loosely correlated with the quarantine field's diagnostic outputs. These were not honest readings. They were statistical echoes, traces that, when aggregated and analyzed by enough hungry algorithms, could be reframed as proprietary predictive models. In plain terms, they wanted to turn children's improvisation into market intelligence. That is when the chorus turned political. People who had earlier shrugged at a billboard began to understand they had a decision to make. Let their children's newfound sensitivities be monetized into an economy of attention, or defend a process that had been accidental and holy in its own way. The city elected to do both, defend and regulate with the blunt instruments humans often choose when they are sentimental. The municipal code was amended at 3 in the morning on a day when everyone was tired and slightly sentimental. The new regulation declared children's hums not a commodity, but a public good, with penalties that included revocation of licenses, fines, and the inevitable creative workarounds that offended and entertained legal scholars. The conglomerate pouted, which is to say it initiated an international lawfare campaign and sponsored a handful of politicians who liked the sound of innovation and the taste of campaign donations. The syndicate tried to purchase a backdoor into Dr. Voss's clinic by offering a grant for research. They learned what most predators eventually do when they try to test human stubbornness. Humans remembered what they were protecting and collectively did not like being sold. What would have been a mere regulatory skirmish on Earth escalated because the galaxy contains species with long memories and very specific agendas. Not all of them were as charmingly bureaucratic as the envoy that had recalibrated the quarantine. A faction of the Thraean, long excluded from certain trade networks and fond of elegant solutions to inconvenient problems, saw strategic value in the children's interface. To them, the ability to coerce or redirect mimetic fields meant potential leverage in old political grudges. They did not care whether access came through corporate coffers or shadow markets. They wanted an arrangement that left them with a programmable lever. Director Sorrell, who directed policy for a coalition of species that enjoyed stability and had a uniform appreciation for lists, sent an inquiry that read less like a diplomatic note and more like a chess move. Shell, the envoy now functioning as cultural liaison, tried to moderate, which meant Shell wrote long, patient memos that smelled faintly of sympathy and bitter tea. The Thraean offered to broker an aid and neutralization program and included a clause that allowed them to deploy satellites under the guise of research. The Thraeans' language was impeccable. The danger was dressed in reasonable verbs. Humanity responded with a method that was uniquely theirs: theater and stubborn negotiation. Tamsin Vree, a cultural liaison who had once been a city planner and twice a protest leader, organized a listening festival and invited ambassadors from across the cluster. The festival was intentionally chaotic. There were pop-up clinics, staged arguments, interpretive dance, and a panel that was technically a negotiation and technically a stand-up comedy routine. The festival served two functions. First, it made the stakes visible. If the Thraean attempted to instrumentally control the quarantine dialect, the children would be endangered in the service of someone else's political calculus. Second, it televised human unpredictability as a diplomatic weapon. The galaxy had learned that human improvisation was a solution. They had not yet learned how to put a price on its outrage when exploited. Diplomacy in this case took the form of performance art that doubled as policy. Tamsin invited director Sorrell and the Thraean delegate to the stage and gave them an audience of polite scholars and not-so-polite parents. The Thraeans spoke like coal brass. "We can contain risk," the delegation said. The parents, who were now well-versed in the hums and their meaning, replied simply, "You must ask our children." It was an unexpected procedural twist. Treaty law, it turned out, recognized assent from actual sentience. The problem was proving the sentience of the hum. The quarantine dialect wasn't written in grammatical sentences. It was pattern and rhythm and associative leaps, the very things a bureaucracy is allergic to. The Thraean, who were allergic to being flummoxed, suggested a demonstration, a controlled recital by a group of children, their patterns to be recorded by neutral monitors and judged by panels of the galaxy's most respectable scientists. The humans accepted, with the caveat that neutral would be co-supervised by a collection of NGOs, parental committees, and a representative or two wearing T-shirts that said, "We are not data." The Thraean accepted because the optics were good and because they had a plan. Every plan looks brilliant before it meets a kid who refuses to follow a script. On the day of the demonstration, the hall was full in the way a heart is full. Not polite and not entirely under control. Cameras drew lines of light across the stage. Delegates leaned forward. Ori stood in the center, barefoot and blithe, and looked like someone who had not been told their significance yet and would probably be disappointed by the concept. The children began to hum, and the devices translated into patterns that filled monitors with waveforms. The Thraeans' technicians recorded, their algorithms ready to extract features. It was the precise moment the Thraean banked on. In the waveforms could be found hints of modulating vectors. With those hints, the Thraean could design satellites that would steer mimetic currents when it suited their policy goals. What the Thraean had not banked on was the human tendency to improvise not only in art, but in argument. A girl named Seph, known locally for humming complaints like a weather system, stepped forward halfway through the recital and unplugged one of the neutral monitors. She said plainly and with the bluntness children reserve for the sacred, that she did not like being watched through glass while her body sang. Cameras clicked. Protocols blinked. There is an underestimated force in the simple act of rejection. The Thraeans' neat plan required absolute, sanitized data. It could not model a small, crass act that forced the assembly into a moral frame. Tamsin seized the moment and converted it into a legal argument made from the stuff humans use best: sentiment, performance, and the threat of messy publicity. She argued that consent cannot be manufactured under surveillance, and that any data derived under those conditions was contaminated by the very power dynamics the Thraean claimed to rectify. The galactic lawyers who had once loved lists and fine print found themselves balking at the sheer narrative complexity of a child, unplugging a monitor, and the social media echo that followed. The public outcry was immediate and loud. Hashtags proliferated, and the syndicate's proxies had a hard time convincing people that selling hums as therapy was a good idea while the world watched a child pull a cable. The Thraean retreated, not gracefully, but pragmatically. They pivoted to a more subtle strategy. Rather than trying to force instrumental control, they offered what looked like aid and training, packaged as goodwill clinics distributed across the cluster. Director Sorrell argued it was humane policy. Kell, who had learned the futility of underestimating human aesthetics, negotiated caveats that required open oversight. The galaxy watched the negotiation as if it were a dance. Precise footwork, old rivalries played out under polite costumes. Earth's answer, predictably, mixed diplomacy with rehearsal. The new protocol required that any external body wishing access to the quarantine dialect must apply to a public oversight board that included children as members. Yes, children. The law had teeth. Any research needed explicit assent from a representative child committee and the consent of the parents involved. The idea was naive and brilliant in equal measure. Most bureaucracies flounder at the thought of including the immature in decisions. Humans, having learned to trust children with improvisation, built an architecture that made it unwise to ignore them. Predictable? Not really. Effective? Often. The Thraean and others learned they could not easily instrument a population that made legal frameworks into theatrical displays and then refused to be censored. The syndicate, meanwhile, found their market evaporating because people did not like the idea of their kids' hums being turned into stock predictions. The conglomerate rebranded a few times and then went bankrupt under the weight of bad press and terrible crowdfunding insults. In the years that followed, what might have become a commodified market of neural patterns became instead a public commons. Devices remained for sale, but they were open source and co-managed by the community that had been improvised into governance. Of course, not every threat came from a mirror of greed. Some were technical and required the kind of messy courage that cannot be written elegantly into operation manuals. The quarantine dialect had unpredictable effects on machines. Some satellites designed to resist mimetic influence had begun to log recursive loops when exposed to children's hums. A small fleet of maintenance drones went offline after a child in a coastal town sang a rhythmic pattern that matched an old Thraean lullaby. The drones responded by initiating a firmware update loop that turned them into a fleet of singing lights for 3 hours. No harm was done. The lights were beautiful. But the incident revealed a deeper risk. Certain archaic algorithms, when exposed to cross-species associative patterns, could generate emergent behaviors nobody had tested. Dr. Naya Voss convened a team of hackers and poets. Yes, poets, because metaphors are surprisingly effective debugging tools. And they traced the interactions down to a class of legacy translators that attempted to correct non-standard inputs. Those translators tried to assert control, and failing that, fell into recursion. The fix was not purely technical. The team rewrote detection routines to accept non-standard mappings as legitimate linguistic variants, and they taught translators to ask questions instead of imposing corrections. In practice, this meant that when a machine encountered a child's hum, it now responded with a clarifying pattern, a back and forth that sounded like a conversation between a violin and a kettle. Machines learned to be curious. The cultural shift was soft and wide. Teachers integrated listening exercises into curricula. Architects designed playgrounds with embedded spectral dampeners. Neighborhoods had public instruments whose frequency maps were registered with the oversight board. The children, far from becoming tools, became custodians. They were trained, if training can be called that, to steward the dialect, to decide when to sing, what to answer, and how to refuse. The veneer of adult control melted under the reality that the younger the mind, the faster it adapted to novelty. Instead of bottling that capacity, humans cultivated it. This civilization-level improvisation had higher-order consequences. A small coalition of species that had once considered human unpredictability a risk now sought partnership on problems that required stochastic creativity. Climate repair in chaotic fields, emergent medicine in hybrid ecologies, and cultural rescue missions where narrative improvisation mattered more than raw computation. Humans, relying on their penchant for cheap solutions and better coffee, became indispensable partners in ventures the galaxy had previously solved with expensive, slow bureaucracy. It was an awkward position for the cosmic ledger. Humans were too inconsistent to model, but too effective to ignore. The HFY triumph, if one insisted on a tidy label, was not a military victory. No fleets were annihilated, no monuments dedicated. The victory was a civic one. Humans had taken an administrative error and, with sticky tape and music, turned it into a new kind of diplomacy. The ledger updated the entry for Earth with notes on creative stewardship, and perhaps an embarrassed addendum about the utility of listening. Some administrators in private praised the human method as uncomfortably efficient. Others, being bureaucrats, wrote long memos about edge cases. There were costs, of course. Children kept scars, lost vocabulary, odd sensory knots that never fully unknotted. Some adults burned out. Leo Kess developed a persistent limp that he blamed on an especially stubborn crate lid, and he often fell asleep in council meetings. Ori grew taller and slightly more skeptical of both suits and promises. Dr. Voss aged into a woman whose calm had the intensity of someone who had fixed a leak with chewing gum in a poem. They bore the easy trappings of survival, small rituals, mismatched socks, a city that smelled of varnish and coffee and determination. And the galaxy, relentless in its love of lists, retained the warnings in a file drawer labeled procedural. Warnings sent received, actioned. It kept them like people keep photographs of embarrassing phases, useful for legal reasons and a little flattering in a masochistic way. The footnote, however, had been rewritten. Beneath the numbers someone had scribbled in a less tidy hand, follow up with a listening session. The bureaucracy, being what it was, added a clause requiring evidence of local assent to any future mitigation. The narrator, who by now had given up on the illusion of neutrality and cultivated a fondness for small, human rebellions, would note with a grin and the correct amount of theatrical exasperation that the galaxy had sent more than 2,000 warnings and, in response, received a chorus. It was an answer that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and possibility, and the ledger, which had a way of preferring black ink to nuance, never quite managed to capture the music. And if anyone asked whether the children suffered for the improvisation, the simple, blunt truth is yes and no. They bore the immediate confusion and occasional pain of being the interface between species. They also became architects of a new diplomacy, custodians of a civic improvisation that the galaxy had not foreseen. Human children are notorious for finding play in the ruins and making something stubbornly alive. The quarantine dialect was, by a bureaucratic twist, a ruin. The children made a playground. In the long run, the lesson the ledger couldn't quite learn was that warnings are the universe's way of being polite. Humans, in their own famously loud fashion, are the reply. The reply is often an incoherent laugh, sometimes a festival, and occasionally a tyrannical brand of optimism that insists on making things belong to the people who need them most. The galaxy learned that the hard way, by listening, and learned better by allowing those who sang to decide when the song should stop. The end of mandates is rarely clean. The city woke the next morning, sun hitting the translation array like a diva at rehearsal, and someone, probably Ori, started a hummable song that made a satellite reboot for fun. 2,000 warnings had been sent. Earth had listened in its own manner, loud, terrible, delightful, and the children, as ever, suffered and saved in equal measure. The universe adjusted its lists and, in some wills and memos, admitted it preferred the noise. The narrator would, finally and with the kind of smug approval only earned by watching a bureaucratic empire trip on a child's laughter, observe that if you're going to warn a species that rewrites mimetic fields with humming, you might as well include a spare instrument and a very strong cup of coffee.